Hello, this is Professor Datta. In this tutorial, we will look at simple approaches that are available in RapidMiner to do data reduction. Since we are looking at tabular data, data reduction essentially consists of some combination of reducing the number of rows and or the number of columns in the table. So specifically, we'll be looking at ways to select a subset of columns from the table, how to do filtering and sampling of rows, and how to do grouping. And in the process, we will also have a brief discussion of why one might want to reduce data prior to analysis. And we will demonstrate these techniques using a used car prices data set from India. So let's start up RapidMiner and see what these techniques look like. So here is the RapidMiner user interface, and I have the data set here. So let me pull up the operator that would import the data set, rather bring it up for analysis. So a quick look at the data set prior to looking at these different operations. So if we run this operator, we can look at what this data set looks like. So just for a reminder, this data set has about 6,000 rows. You can see here, they're about 5,997 or about 6,000 rows. And there are 12 attributes, some of which are quantitative, like kilometers driven, and the price that you can see at the end, the number of seats, the engine capacity in cubic centimeters, and the power. And some attributes are qualitative, like the type of transmission and the fuel type. Okay, now the simple statistics tab also reminds us that some of the attributes have missing values. For instance, mileage has 2 missing values, engine is 14 missing, and so forth. Okay, so coming back to the data, a quick discussion on why one might want to reduce the data prior to analysis. So just imagine as if this data set had, instead of 6,000 rows, had 60,000 rows, and instead of 12 attributes had 20 or 30 attributes. Okay, so when it comes to reducing the number of rows, one of the reasons why one might want to reduce the number of rows is simply to get rid of missing data. So any row that has a missing value is a candidate for elimination. So that might be one reason why you want to reduce the data set. The other is depending on the analysis. For instance, in this particular data set, I might just want to analyze data for manual transmission cars, or I might want to separately analyze data for only automatic transmission cars, or perhaps all cars from a particular city. So there are a whole host of reasons why I might want to pull out a subset of the rows in order to do further analysis. Then when it comes to columns, I might also, again, depending on the analysis, for instance, I might just be interested in analyzing what if there's any relationship between the mileage of the car and the price of the car, which I expect there would be. But if that's the only relationship I want to quantify, then those are the only 2 columns or attributes that I would pick. Alternatively, if I wanted to formalize or quantify relationship between the price of the car and the type of transmission as well as its mileage, then those are the 3 attributes or columns I might pick out. So depending on the type of analysis one wants to do, there are lots of reasons why we want to reduce engage in data reduction prior to analysis, that is, reduce the number of rows and or the number of columns. Now, just since we are completing this discussion here, just remember that reducing the number of columns can come in different flavors. One, of course, is picking out a subset of columns that I just mentioned. There's another technique where subsets of attributes are combined into super attributes, so to speak. And that's also an important type of data reduction, or called dimensionality reduction. We will not engage or discuss that further here in this tutorial, but just be aware that that's a more sophisticated type of data reduction that's specifically in the number of columns that's available. So with that brief discussion, let's look at the operations themselves. The first operation I will show you is how to select a subset of columns from the data set. So let me delete this spline or this link. And there is an operator here which lets you select attributes. So I will select the attributes over here, bring in this operator. I'll feed the original data set into this input port of this operator, connect the output port of this operator to results, and now I proceed to go ahead and select the attributes. Now, here I would say select a subset of attributes, and then I can, using this particular button, the select attributes button over here, the dialog box opens up and I can choose whatever attributes I want. Now, just for example's sake, I might want the fuel type. I pull it over to the right. I might want the location, that is the city in which the car is being sold. I might want the power and the price perhaps, and let's say the type of transmission. Of course, you can see there are any number of attributes that you could pick, and you apply this selection. Now, after this selection process, if I run this process, then you can see that I have subsetted a number of fewer columns than what we had in the original data set. So this is a simple way of reducing the data, which occurs by reducing the number of columns that you have. Okay, so now let's look at a different approach. Now how would I select a subset of rows? So let me maybe perhaps delete this operator and show you just how one would work with the rows separately. So one of the operations that we have in RapidMiner that allows us to pick out rows is the filtering operation. So okay, so if I go down the list of operators over here, do you see one of these choices here says filter examples? So I'll bring up this operator called filter examples, and I feed the raw data into this filter, and I connect the output to results, and now I proceed to do my filtering. So this filtering that you have is very powerful in the sense that you can specify all kinds of different criteria to help you pull out subsets of rows from the table. For instance, I could pick the attribute, one of the attributes, which was, let's say, power, and I could say pick only those rows for which power does not have missing values, so where power is not missing. Okay, so I apply this operator and I run the process, and you can see that we originally had about 6,000 rows. The number of rows has reduced. It's 5,876. This automatically tells you that certain rows, in this case particularly, rows that have a null value for power, those have been removed. Okay, but there are certainly other filters that one could apply. For example, after removing those null values, I could add another filter. Let's say I add another entry, and I say that the year is less than 2014. So I only want cars that are less than 2014 in the year that they were sold. Okay, so I apply this criterion, and if I now run the process, you can see that we drop down from about 6,000 rows to 2,617 rows. So I've again subsetted a number of rows, subset of rows from the set of all rows that we have. So we have reduced the data. Similarly, I could use all kinds of other criteria, maybe a certain fuel type, maybe a certain transmission type, but you get the general idea of how one might filter data from the data set. Filtration essentially allows us to select a subset of the rows based on a whole host of different criteria. So now let's go back to design, and I will delete this operator now. Another way in which you can select a subset of rows is by what is called sampling. Okay, so in the operator panel, you can see I've just typed in sampling, and there are different kinds of sampling methods. We'll pick the simplest one, where it essentially does random sampling. So I pick up the sample operator, I connect the raw data importation operator to the input port of sampling, and the output I put into results. Okay, so now I go back to this sampling operator, and in the parameters panel, this is where I can play with how many rows or what kind of subset I want to pull out from the main dataset. For instance, here, if you look at these two parameters, it says absolute 100. This is simply telling RapidMiner, pick exactly 100 rows from the dataset. Okay, and that's done randomly. So you give an absolute number of the rows that need to be picked. So if I run this process now, you can see in the output 100 rows have been picked out of the 6,000 that were there. But also notice that it has picked the rows randomly. So this is 105, 218, 947, 1072. So the rows have been picked randomly, records have been picked randomly, but it has picked exactly 100 of them. Okay. Alternatively, instead of picking an absolute number, 100 records, you could do a relative, and you can say pick 10% of the records or pick 20% of the records approximately. So, and again, it would pick randomly. So let's say I specify 20% of the records. So I should get roughly, let's say 6,000 times 0.2, I should get roughly 1,200 records. Let's see what we get. I run this and you can see, okay, roughly 1,200 records have been extracted. Once again, you can see from here, the second column, this is the record number from the original data set. So it has been picked randomly, but 2,000 records have been picked. Okay, so sampling is another way in which one can extract subsets of records from the data set. But notice that when you sample, you are picking the entire row. That is, you're not picking subsets of columns from these things. So it picks the entire row, but a subset of rows from the original table. All right. So now let me delete this operator and go on to another method that we have for reducing the number of rows. And this is a little bit different, and it's called grouping. And here you're not really selecting a subset of rows. It operates on the rows, but you're not really selecting a subset of the rows. You're kind of collapsing the rows and you're aggregating them in some way. So it's those of you who know SQL would recognize this operation right away. It's called it's the group by operation, but let's see how it would work in RapidMiner. So it's an aggregation operation which essentially reduces the number of rows, but it reduces the number of rows not by selecting rows, but by collapsing them in a particular way. So now, okay, so sorry here. So aggregation, I pick, I write down as in the search box for in the operator panel, and from it you can see that the aggregate operator shows up. So I pull up the aggregate operator, then I feed the raw data into the input port, and the output results port, I connect it to the I connect the aggregate output port of the aggregate operator to the results port. And now I go ahead to customize aggregate. So if you look at the parameter panel on the right hand side, there are two buttons here that essentially control how the aggregation works. The first one that we will focus on is what is called by this group by attribute. So essentially what you're trying to tell RapidMiner is take the raw data set and collapse the rows grouped by a certain attribute. So to show you an example, let's say I select that it is to group by city, by location, which is the city in which the car was sold. Okay. So what would happen is that what RapidMiner would do, it would take the original data set, and conceptually what it would do, it would sort this data set by city so that all the cars that are associated with a particular city come together. Okay, so if I run this operator now, you can see that it's pulled out all these cities. So there are 11 cities in there, but this list by itself is not interesting. Let's go back to the design. So I'm just showing you what the group by does. Is it sorts out by the attribute that you have picked. And now we have to tell RapidMiner, once you have grouped the records by these cities, what do you want me to do with each of these groups? Okay, so here in this first button, which we had ignored up to now, where it says aggregation attribute, let's click on that. And you can see that I have to, it makes sense to pick out certain attributes that, and you will tell RapidMiner what to do with each of those attributes for those groups. Okay, so we have grouped by city, by location in this case. So let's, for instance, let's pick price. And you can see that the aggregation function, the default there is average. So what I have just told RapidMiner is, once you have grouped these original records by city, then for each city, compute the average of the car prices. Okay, so there might be 1,000 or let's say 500 cars in city 1, 200 cars in city 2, and so forth. So for each city, compute the average price. Okay, and I can add others. So let's just keep this here and see what answer we get. If I run this process now, look at the result. You can see what RapidMiner has done. So all those 6,000 records have been grouped by city. Here, that's the first attribute. We said group by location. And then for each location, it has computed the average price. Okay, so let's continue with this operation over here, this activity. So I could say that in addition to average price, let's say I also want the average mileage. Sorry, I deleted that by mistake. So price, I wanted the average. Let's add another attribute, which is the mileage, the kilometers driven, and I also want the average. Okay, so now I've just told RapidMiner that for each city, compute the average price of the cars as well as the average kilometers driven. Okay, so now if I run this particular process, you can see the output. Again, the 6,000 records have been grouped by city, by location, and for each group we have the average price and the average mileage. So what one could do now is, now that the data has been reduced from 6,000 rows to 11 rows, now this is a pretty drastic reduction, but what one could conceptually do is filter out these last two rows, filter out average price and average kilometers, and do a regression just on these aggregated values. Okay, so you would have 11 data points and you could do a regression on those. So once you have reduced the data, in this case by grouping, one can proceed with different kinds of analysis that one doesn't again need to do with the original data set. So hopefully this tutorial has shown you some simple approaches that RapidMiner offers to us to reduce the data prior to analysis. And just to summarize, since we are dealing with tables, the data reduction consists of ways to reduce the number of rows and or the number of columns that are there in the original data set. So we looked at ways to select a subset of columns. We looked at how to filter rows from the data set. We looked at how to sample rows from the data set. And we also looked at how to aggregate or collapse data set using the grouping operation. So thank you for watching.